Good afternoon, everyone. We started off this afternoon with a set of data collected by the Bloomberg Equality Team. It's taking a look at just how white and male some U.S. companies truly are. It's all part of a push for more transparency in corporate America to just see how companies are holding up against initial responses last year during the Black Lives Matter protests. Here to discuss what the Bloomberg Equality Team uncovered is consumer goods reporter Gerald Porter Jr. Hey, Gerald, thanks so much for joining us on this. A big congrats to you and your colleagues on this accountability tracker. So your team reached out to 100 of the nation's biggest corporations. What did you find?
Well, we found that about 37 of them or so were ready to be less cagey than they've been when it comes to releasing this disclosed, published race data. And so when it comes to this form that we call the EEO, the gold standard, a lot of companies file this to the EEOC every year, but it's just not made to the public. And so what we have now is that a lot more data is out. We're also seeing trends where we're confirming what we anecdotally knew, where races such as Blacks, Latinos, and Asians are represented less frequently in management roles across these 100 companies. And for the ones that we haven't been able to acquire data from, it's still clear from the data they provided that there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to making these workforces resemble the populations and demographics represented in the world.
Yeah, the piece is chock full of data and concerning statistics. Here's one. Only 4 of the 37 companies had Black people in 10% or more of executive and management roles, even though Black people make up 13% of the U.S. population. Hispanic representation also trailed national figures at many companies. Gerald, is there any indication that this is improving in corporate America?
Well, it's one of those examples where companies are starting to open their eyes and to see where they can improve this, dark trend, so to speak. We look at how many companies, about 80 or so, are recruiting and expanding their recruitment to HBCUs after the events in the summer. And a lot of these companies like Mondelez, for example, are setting some quantified targets. So for Mondelez, it's to double the representation for Black people in management. And we start to see this across the board when we look at deep down in the data, what companies need to do and how these goals fit their plans and current status. But there's a few companies ahead of the pack and some others, and happy to dive into those.
Yeah. So who is ahead of the pack?
Yes. So McDonald's is a good example of this, considering how they're a company that's doing better when it comes to Black folks being represented in management. They're about 13% right now, which is way above the average that we found in this project. And when you look across the board, Verizon, totally different industries in a similar camp. Only their count of Black people in management is about 14%, so a little higher. And when we look across spaces, again, we see that these figures are illuminating because some companies, such as a Salesforce, for example, really have a lot of work to do in this field. So it goes without saying that a lot of the execs in these companies are white men. But when you look at a Salesforce and their management data, you see that that team is 70% white compared to the near 2% of Black people that are in those same roles. And so when you kind of compare and break that down, look at the data, you get a real sense for how this inequality can play out for different companies in different spaces.
It's so interesting because there are a lot of different questions in this, and I encourage people to go check it out at Bloomberg.com because it's an interactive piece. There's a question: has the company implemented any specific targets for representation in its management team? That's one of the questions that your team asked the companies. 55 companies said no or didn't respond, including some of those companies that you mentioned that actually are doing a good job. Verizon, for example. So even though it is doing a good job when it comes to representation, at least it's a good in the sense of it's above average of its peers, it doesn't actually have those targets, right? Or it didn't respond, I should say.
Correct. And it's not to put words in the company's mouths, which we did our best to exactly not do. But when you look at a trend like that, where a company might be outperforming the rest of its peers and even the top 100 companies in terms of a Black representation in management, when you don't see the goals, that's where the imagination starts to kick in and it starts to become clear that maybe these companies see that that's enough. Now, 13% is racial parity when it comes to Black folks' population. But when it comes to this idea of diversity, it's not only about improving the counts at which workforces are diverse, but also the roles that they can climb in. And so where you see some companies not necessarily having a target, they might be putting systems in place like career development programs or support groups or accelerator programs where companies can actually allow and help Black workers ascend through the ranks as they can in other roles. Where you look at a McDonald's, it might be people coming up in management roles at restaurants. So it's a lot of just diversion trends happening, but it's interesting to see how one company can see higher diversity, but not commit to a certain target to improve it even further.
Let's go back to these EEO-1 forms that you talked about. Is there any movement to have more disclosure? It's kind of surprising that only 37 of the companies that you reached out to said that the company has provided an EEO-1 form, whereas 63% of them, 63%, said no or didn't respond.
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing with the EEO-1 form, and it's why we call it the gold standard of sorts, is that the only way for us, the people, anyone really, to know where somebody is going is to understand the progress that needs to be made. And in the case of diversity, those details have always been mysterious, even though companies have said in their own ways that they're working on diversity and care about it. So while some companies will release their own gender and race breakdowns annually, those numbers can be aggregated however the company chooses, conflating certain races and just making a broader umbrella of diverse hires. And as a professor we spoke to for the first edition of this project said, they can be sliced and spliced to display the best results. And in that sense, getting a company's race data is necessary as much as it is critical if we're talking about how these corporate pledges to improve diversity will actually work, take shape, and these companies will be held accountable.
Well, it's a really important feature, Gerald, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us on the
Absolutely.
show. I encourage everybody to check it out. That's Bloomberg's consumer goods reporter, Gerald Porter Jr. Thanks again for your time and for helping us highlight the work of the Bloomberg Equality Team. The Bloomberg Equality Team has a revamped website that focuses on the 4 pillars of corporate leadership: capital, society, and solutions, among others. Quick Take's going to be featuring a new equality story each day of this week, so be sure to check back in tomorrow to see the team's latest work.